Peace, King. How you feeling?
Peace, I'm good. How about yourself?
All is well. All is well. I want to thank you so much for coming on the platform. This is definitely an honor. I truly appreciate the work that you're doing, and I look forward to hearing more about it.
For sure, definitely. Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Oh yeah, no doubt. It's an honor. It's an honor. I don't know if I told you or not. I'm in East Africa, so it's
Oh,
not as
okay,
technically advanced. So if I get disconnected or break up, you can continue to speak, and then
okay,
I'll edit it once it's over.
okay.
Cool, cool.
You're in
Um,
Tanzania or Kenya?
no, I'm in Madagascar.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Let me see. Okay, for the viewers who may not recognize you, let them know who you are, where you're from, and definitely what do you do.
All right. So greetings, everyone. My name is Dr. Kamau Rashid. I'm a professor at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago. I'm also the president of the Midwest region of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations and the director of the Kemetic Institute of Chicago. I'm a scholar. I write about Africana thought, what I call critical African social thought, specifically about what we call the Chicago School of African Centered Thought, which includes thinkers like Jacob H. Carruthers, Dr. Anderson Thompson, Dr. Harold Pates, and others, as well as I also write about W.B. Du Bois, particularly Du Bois is a social theorist, that is, someone who attempted to understand the nature of society as well as attempted to formulate ideas, ideas which would be relevant in terms of the transformation of society. Also read about various Africana cultural traditions. I've written about hip hop as a type of educational tool to create critical consciousness. That is, critical consciousness being a way of thinking about society, which compels one to ask deep questions related to the idea or the goal, the objective of social transformation. I've written about languages, specifically the idea of a Pan-African language that is a shared language for the African world and the various prospects for that, as well as capoeira, which is an Afro-Brazilian fighting art. I also teach Afro-diaspora martial arts as well. So,
Wow, that's an impeccable resume, man. That sounds awesome. Now I got to ask you this: when did you develop this passion for history? Is this something that you always been into since you were young, or did you kind of
mhm.
get an appreciation for it later in life?
That's a good question. I think for me, I definitely think it started when I was young. I wanted, to understand the world, and I felt like, unfortunately, that I wasn't given the tools that I needed in order to meaningfully make sense of the world around me. So I think my interest in the past was an outgrowth of my desire to understand the world, and that's certainly something that began when I was a child, probably at least by the time I was about 9 or 10 years old, and that continued certainly into my teenage years. And I think when I was a teenager, about 16, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and that had a very significant impact in terms of my consciousness, both in terms of how I thought about the nature of the world and the power relations of the world, but also the importance of the past as the source wherein the particular arrangements, the way in which the world is organized, that these things emerge from the past, from historic events, right? And so, yeah, I think definitely when I was younger, and of course, as I got into college, it's interesting because my undergraduate degree is in sociology, but and of course sociology deals with the study of society, largely contemporary societies, but I was reading just as much history as I was reading sociology. Of course, the historical studies was outside of class, and a lot of it, certainly at a certain point in probably around my first or second year in undergrad, maybe my third year as well, was largely focused on Black social movements, especially the movements of the 1960s and 70s. And so, yeah, I've always been interested in the past. Part of my concern is that, I guess there are multiple things. One, of course, is that the past is the context which prefigures the present. That is, the past is the foundation for the world in which we exist. But also, our knowledge of the past, I think, has implications in terms of how we attempt to shape the present and therefore the future. And so I think, a lot of those African thinkers, people like John Henrik Clarke and Sheikh Anta Diop, and of course, my teachers, Jacob H. Carruthers, Anderson Thompson, I think they recognize the critical importance of the past in terms of how we understand the world and how we understand our capacity to reshape it, right? And so what I've came to understand later on is that for many of our thinkers, studying the past is not just about understanding the past, but it was also about how we shape the future. And so therein, I think is also why the past is important.
Yeah, definitely, man. So many people take that history for granted, but it can be empowering and it
Hmm.
can be utilized. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
Especially our people for sure. You know.
Yeah.
Okay, now. Okay, I wanted to ask you about this. You actually teach martial arts. You teach
Mhm.
capoeira. For the viewers who may not know exactly what is it and how did you get connected with it? Because I studied abroad in Brazil, so I'm familiar with
Oh,
it. But if you
excellent,
talk about
excellent.
it a little
For
bit.
sure, for sure. Yeah. So capoeira is an Afro-Brazilian martial art. It's a combat tradition that many practitioners of capoeira, and some scholars also link it to combat traditions from the Congo Angola area. That if you study the history of enslavement, the Portuguese had a very strong, had very powerful presence centuries past in the Congo Angola area, and so were responsible in many respects for the depopulation of a number of the polities in those regions, such as the Congo Kingdom. And so you had brought to Brazil as well as other parts of the Americas very large numbers of captives, again from what is today Congo as well as Angola. And so capoeira as a fighting art, many people argue, is largely based on a combat tradition, a pre-existing Angolan combat tradition called Ngolo. One of the things that distinguishes Ngolo from other martial traditions, a lot of people tend to be very familiar with Asian martial arts. One of the things that distinguishes Ngolo, perhaps two attributes. One is the use of inverted attacks, that is, striking while inverted, striking while upside down, as well as the use of escapes in preference to blocks, right? So one of the key elements of Ngolo and also of Capoeira is the idea of evading rather than blocking, and so Capoeira forms in Brazil from the foundation of Ngolo, but also in response to the social political environment of enslavement and resistance to enslavement, right? One of the key elements of course, this is true all throughout the diaspora. There were two principal, um, I would say three principal forms of resistance to enslavement. Insurrection was one, rebellions, revolts, maroonage being the second, and then what I would call day-to-day forms of resistance: sabotage, working slow, pretending to be sick, all the kind of things that people do to resist without giving the impression that they're resisting in order to protect themselves. I call those day-to-day forms of resistance. And of course, in Brazil, capoeira, I think, is in many ways very much related, especially to those first two traditions, the insurrectionary tradition and the maroon tradition, and certainly the maroon tradition. I was reading, there's a wonderful book, like if people want to understand capoeira from a historic vantage point, the two books that I'd recommend, one is the ABC Beabá of Capoeira de Angola by Dr. Edward Poe, which is a very, very powerful book, which discusses the history of capoeira, but also talks about the structure and the structure of capoeira and how capoeira works as a game. So it's a masterful book. Again, and then the second book would be the Fighting for Honor by Desh Obi, which is a very powerful book. It provides a history. Basically, it looks at Afro-diasporan arts more broadly, but there's the entirety of the third part of that book looks at capoeira, especially in Rio in the 19th century. So capoeira, because it's a fighting art and because Africans in Brazil are resisting enslavement, capoeira is necessarily a part of that African resistance to enslavement, right? It's a fundamental part of that tradition, that history. And many of the accounts, and there are a number of them in Desh Obi's book, there's some in Dr. Poe's book, they're very audacious, very audacious. There was one account in Desh Obi's book of a situation where a quilombola, that is a maroon, the maroons are the people who ran away from the plantations and set up their own communities. Well, in Brazil, some quilombos were more or less urban formations. Most of the time, like in the United States, where I'm from, quilombos tended to be in the hinterland, right? Especially in swamps and other for other places which were forbidding, or were not forbidding, but many places which were difficult to access, right? That which were remote, such swamps, and in Brazil and parts of the Caribbean, quilombos or maroon communities were often in mountainous areas. And so in Rio de Janeiro, however, in the city, near and around the city of Rio de Janeiro, you would have quilombos on the outskirts of the city, and so there was one account that Shelby shares in the book. This book, I believe it was from the 19th century, where the police or the military had captured a quilombolo, again, a maroon, and some of his compatriots who were capoeiristas went to free him. And so Quilombo so capoeira was a big part of how Black people in Brazil fought against enslavement. And as a part of suppressing African people and negating African agency, capoeira was outlawed in the 19th century. In fact, even before it was outlawed in the 19th century, there was repression of capoeira. So there were certain points in the 19th century where many of the prisons and jails in Rio de Janeiro were full of capoeiristas who were, accused of violating this law or that law. And so capoeira in Rio, to a large extent, goes underground. Again, and I should say, the reason why it was outlawed was because it was seen as something which enabled or which facilitated Africans' resistance to oppression. And this isn't unique, right? We find other examples of African martial traditions being outlawed in other parts of the diaspora as well. But in the case of Brazil, it forces the art underground. And this really doesn't change until the 20th century. Certainly in Bahia, you get very pioneering mestres, people like mestres Bimba and Pastinha, who work to revitalize capoeira in some respects. And also I would argue I would say perhaps to represent capoeira. And I think that was especially concerned. In fact, there's a book called Staging Brazil by Anna Hoffling, where she essentially argues that these mestres were trying to represent capoeira because the Brazilian authorities had portrayed capoeira as the art of hooligans, of malandros, thugs, right? Undesirable and savory individuals. But the reality is that, capoeira was linked to Afro-Brazilian cultural traditions, linked to their resistance traditions, therefore linked to their collective agency. And so therefore the art had to be repressed. One of the things that's interesting about capoeira, of course, again, these two masters, they, engage in the work. And they're not alone. There are many others like Mestres Caissara, Cajinquinha, and others who are working to revitalize capoeira. Eventually, by the time you get to the 1980s, 1970s, and the capoeira is becoming an international phenomenon, right? Where you have capoeira masters who are going to the United States and parts of Europe and other places, and they're teaching capoeira. They're establishing capoeira schools or capoeira academies. And so capoeira becomes increasingly known in the United States. And this is kind of where I come into the scene. I grew up watching Kung Fu movies. I can remember even when I was little, back in the 70s, like a little guy watching Kung Fu movies. And so I was just enthralled with this. And throughout my whole childhood in the 1980s, was very desirous of learning martial arts. Unfortunately, I was never able to. It wasn't until I got to college that I was able to learn martial arts. And once I was able to, I, just immersed myself in it. And at some point, the middle of my undergrad, a friend of mine mentioned to me this art called capoeira. He did this dance-like move called the Jenga. And I was like, it looked strange to me, but I was like, well, hey, it's Black, I'd like to learn more about that. And so I don't know if it was him or someone else. They told me about a movie called Only the Strong. I went and watched that movie. And I didn't think it was the best movie. It's not an excellent movie, but but it does present capoeira. And so it was interesting. And I think it planted a seed in my mind. And I want to say probably about 4 years after that, I became increasingly desirous of not only learning capoeira, but also learning some of these other Afro-diasporan traditions. And so eventually I moved to St. Louis, Missouri, and I found a brother named Taboho. At that time, Taboho was teaching. He had a capoeira class who was with the group Taye Uhuru. And so Taboho was really my first capoeira teacher. And I really got my foundation of capoeira from Taboho. Then a few years after that, I moved back to Chicago. I hooked up with a brother here who was teaching capoeira Angola in the community. And so I hooked up with him and started practicing capoeira Angola, eventually started teaching it with him. And so we had a kind of a partnership. And a number of years later, I connected with, of course, Dr. Edward Poe, who was a student of Mestre Pastinha, from whom I've been able to learn a great deal about capoeira. And he's a very significant figure, particularly in terms of the historicity of capoeira in this country. And then and not too long after that, also connected and became a student of Mestre Preto Velho. Mestre Preto Velho is a student of a very famous master in Brazil named Mestre Toro, who practices a style of capoeira from Rio de Janeiro, which he calls capoeira Angola de Salpinto Grande, and is a very rich style, a very beautiful tradition. So that was my long road to capoeira, and one of the things that intrigued me about capoeira, which compelled me, again, beginning in the 90s, really to want to learn it, was that I increasingly wanted to understand how our people approach the combative arts, right? How do we as a people approach the combative arts? One of the things that I intuited about these arts, which was later confirmed, like one of the things that you get when you watch kung fu movies, as well as other, martial arts movies, whether they're from South Asia or what have you, the history and the traditions of the people are embedded in those films, right? Those expressions, those depictions of those arts. So it's not just the technical presentation of the art, but it's also the dramatization of key historical elements or key social dynamics relevant to that. Probably one of the best examples of this in terms of a very popular series of films have been the Yip Man movies, right? Where key elements of Chinese history are also embedded within the story. And I think this is also an important element. Similarly, I suspected that the same dynamic would be at play in terms of these Afro-diasporan traditions. That is, that they would also reflect key elements, not only in terms of the history of Black people in a very general sense, but the resistance traditions of Black people very specifically, right? That these arts were a part of our story in terms of how we fought, not just fought in terms of having fighting ability, but how we fought against the enemy, right? How we fought against those who desired to oppress African people, who saw within our oppression the capacity to gain, and yet we resisted that. And so, and of course, that was confirmed, right? So for all the Afro-diasporan arts that I've been exposed to, that's been one of the recurring elements. And so my journey to capoeira, that was part of my motivation in learning it. And certainly that's something that has been realized, not just with capoeira, but also many of the other arts that I've been able to be exposed to.
Wow. Okay. That's amazing. Yeah, I'm from Cleveland. I'm from the Midwest, so I can relate. I definitely can. I guess I could share my perspective a little bit.
Yeah.
Like I studied abroad in DR. I studied abroad in Brazil, and what I come to see is like in Brazil, for example, they'll say, "Well, we got this martial art from, like you say, Angola." They'll be
Yeah.
specific about it, or they'll be like, "We got this religious practice from the Yoruba in
Yep.
Nigeria. We
Yep.
got this from the Congo." Where in America, we don't really get that. It's just like slavery started right here,
Mm-hmm.
and we just invented a lot of stuff, and it's not really no cultural connection. Even if it was, like, you'd be
Mm-hmm.
like, "Okay, well, it was a rebellion, but we don't know what spiritual praises or dances or nothing
Mm-hmm.
they were doing. It's just
Mm-hmm.
slavery and everything forward from there." So that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about,
Mm-hmm.
studying out there. It's a beautiful culture.
Yeah, and I think I appreciate that you said that, because you're right. There is a difference in terms of let's say the nature of historic memory, right? Uh, and you see this in the fighting arts. Like you see this in a range of cultural domains, whether we're talking about spiritual practices or languages, food traditions, but you definitely see it in the fighting arts, and that's been very interesting to me just to observe, right? Because like you were saying, right, capoeira, they ascribe that tradition to Angola, right? They ascribe much of contemplate, though not all of it, to the Yoruba. Where if you look at like Mani, El Juego de Mani, which is a sister art of capoeira from Cuba, much of that art is ascribed to the Congo, right? Or if you look at Kalinda, which is a stick fighting art that you find throughout the Caribbean, as well as Louisiana, much of that art is ascribed also to Congo. So it's interesting to me, and I think you had that in the United States, and I think to a certain extent it persists, but I think it's weaker. I think it's weaker in a number of ways, and I have some ideas in terms of why it may be weaker. And by that I mean, like in certain places, like if you like in Louisiana or coastal areas of Georgia and South Carolina, I think that the substance of that historic memory is perhaps stronger, more robust. But you're right. Yeah, when I grew up in Chicago, Black culture was treated as if it was something that just kind of just fell out of the sky. It had no origin. Black culture has no father, you know, which is obviously not true. Which is obviously not true. You can look at our language, you can look at our food, you can look at our dance. All these things can be traced back to things from the Caribbean as well as the African continent, even further back. But the integrity of the historic memory pertaining to that is very different than in contrast to other parts of the diaspora, and that's unfortunate, I think, in a number of ways.
Right, you're right. It's there, but you got to just put a little more effort in it. Find out, like,
You
okay,
do.
yeah, I see where you got that from. But
Exactly.
yeah, I can agree with that. Oh, I want to ask you about the late great Jacob Carruthers. Now, you got
Yeah.
a book about him. What
Mhm.
inspired you to write it, and where can the viewers check it out? How can they support?
Yeah. So I was a student at Northeastern Illinois University's what is today called the Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies. When I was a student there, it was just called the Center for Inner City Studies. I was a student there back in the late 2000s. I'm sorry, the early 2000s. Goodness, the early 2000s. I think I started there. I think it was the spring of 2000. I think it was the first semester that I was there. And that first semester, he was one of my teachers. Him and Dr. Anderson Thompson. But that wasn't my initial encounter with his ideas, right? That was my initial encounter with him. But my initial encounter with his ideas was via his book, Essays in Ancient Egyptian Studies, which I purchased. I want to say like 6 years earlier. So I had that book. I don't think I had his other books, but did have that book, and I had that book for a number of years. And my time at the Carruthers Center, studying with him and Dr. Thompson, as well as so many others, Leon Harris, Yvonne Jones, Dr. Conrad Worrell, that time left an indelible impression on my thinking. I was already familiar with many of the ideas, right, pertaining to the importance of African people being independent, being free, the importance of us having a sense of our history, the importance of us working to bring into being a future reflective of our own worldview, right, as a people, and the idea of us using that worldview as a basis whereby we think about the transformation of the world. So many of those ideas I was familiar with to a degree or another, but certainly my time there greatly deepened my understanding of those ideas, right? And it was after I graduated from there, I went on to begin working on a PhD at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I was quite unintentionally began to revisit some of those ideas and begin to draw upon those ideas in my own work as a doctoral student. I think the first instance of this, I want to say it was back in the spring of, seems like the spring of 2004. So this is like 2 years after I graduated from the Carruthers Center. I wrote a paper where I was juxtaposing Dr. Carruthers' thinking about education as articulated in his book, Intellectual Warfare, and Carter G. Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro. And I ended up actually publishing that as an article in a journal some years later. But that was really the beginning of it. And it was, again, wasn't, something that it just kind of sort of thing that just happened. These ideas seemed like they were most appropriate to the questions that I was grappling with at the time. And then after I graduated and I began working as a professor in Chicago, I found, there were a couple of things. There's a Jacob H. Carruthers conference that happens every February. That's sponsored by the Kemetic Institute of Chicago. And of course, there was also the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations conferences, both the International Conference and also the Midwest Region conferences. And what would happen once I got back is that almost every year I'm presenting at those conferences or so on. And these were good opportunities, especially the Carruthers Conference, to talk about the ideas of Jacob H. Carruthers. And I want to say it was probably, and then I should add, and on occasions when I would get invited to speak in the community, oftentimes I would draw upon his ideas, right? One of the things, so there were two things that were at play here. One of the things that I think is vitally important, particularly for people who are struggling to concretize their agency in the world, is that they draw upon the ideas of those people who sought to inform that process, right? Because, of course, there have been many generations of Black thinkers who have sought to inform that process, again, of how we free ourselves, how we create a world that reflects, the as Dr. Anderson Thompson would say, the greatest good, for African people. But one of the problems is that in many instances, Black intellectuals, Black activists, Black policymakers do not draw upon that ancestral legacy. And that is a sad and unfortunate reality. In fact, many, I would argue, especially speaking of Black intellectuals and as well as Black activists, many of them are orphans of the Black intellectual tradition, given that they have wedded themselves to Eurocentric paradigms and orientations to social transformation. And so for me, it felt very important to build upon Dr. Carruthers' ideas and to attempt to understand how his thinking, as well as the thinking of other Black thinkers like Dr. Thompson and others, as well as certainly Du Bois, since I read about Du Bois, how their ideas might inform how we think about the world and how we seek to transform it. And what I realized, of course, by the mid-2010s is that I keep writing these things about Dr. Carruthers. Perhaps I'm writing a book about Dr. Carruthers. So it wasn't like I started out saying, hey, I'm going to write a book about Jacob H. Carruthers. It was just, I kept accumulating writing about his ideas. And I was like, well, clearly I'm writing a book since I keep writing all this stuff about the man and his ideas. And I think, and it was after that I became somewhat more methodical in terms of attempting to capture, let's say, the breadth of his thought. Because Jacob H. Carruthers, for those who are not familiar with him, was a scholar at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago. He was a founder of the Kemetic Institute of Chicago, the Temple of the African Community of Chicago, as well as the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. He was a scholar whose works explored certainly the Haitian Revolution, history and deep thought, or some people say philosophy of the Nile Valley, African spirituality, African thought, in a number of respects, particularly as it relates to governance and education, and on and on and on and on. So, as well as knowledge, one of the things that he was very concerned about was knowledge, how we construct ideas, how the foundations of the ideas that we rest upon. And then I would say perhaps lastly would be his concerns about the intellectual foundation of the modern world. That is, he had concluded, rightfully so, that everything that we see around us are based on ideas. Everything that we see around us is based on a particular worldview. Well, one of the problems is that in many instances, we do not understand the worldview upon which the world that we live in has been organized. And he argued that it was necessary to understand that worldview and to understand the degree to which it may be antithetical to the well-being of African people, if not the world itself. And so for me, I believed that by writing, it could be a useful model in terms of how we build on the intellectual foundation of our ancestors, right? And how we draw upon those ideas and use those ideas to inform of how we engage in the world, both as thinkers, as educators, but also as people who are engaging in the action of transforming our community in whatever capacity in which we are doing that, right? And so for me, really the idea with the book was to help to continue to push his ideas further into the future, so that generations of African people in the years, decades, and centuries to come can engage with his thinking, and the important ways in which his thinking can inform how we exist in the world. So the book is available from Roman Littlefield. So if you just Google, the title of the book is Jacob H. Carruthers and the Restoration of an African Worldview, Finding Our Way Through the Desert. So, people can just Google it and it'll take you to the publisher's website, or you can go on Amazon and you can Google Jacob H. Carruthers, or you can Google my name, Kamau Rashid, and the book should come right up.
Okay, wow, that's heavy, man. I appreciate you taking on a project like that. I'm gonna have to check it out for the viewers will as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Let me see. I wanted to drop one more question. Is that
Sure.
cool?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I was checking out your profile. Now you got a chance to study in Ghana. If you could talk about, what inspired you to do that, and what were you studying? And also, I believe you got a book in the works about W.E.B. Du Bois. Is that connected?
Yeah. So I wanted to. I was writing, kind of similar to my experience with Dr. Carruthers' ideas. I was writing different things about Du Bois, and at a certain point, it was like, hey, I should just go ahead and make this a book. I wrote my dissertation about W.E.B. Du Bois, and as I began to sit back and to plot out what a prospective book about Du Bois' ideas would entail, there were a number of topics which were immediately relevant to me. One of those topics was Pan-Africanism. For those that don't know, I think most people are probably familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois, but W.E.B. Du Bois was, I would argue, the premier Black intellectual of the 20th century. He was a pioneer in the formation of the discipline of sociology in the United States. Not just like a Black pioneer, he was a pioneer to the entire formation of the discipline of sociology in the United States itself. In addition to being a pioneering Black thinker, a pioneering scholar of history, both in terms of his study of African history, as well as the history of enslavement. This was the subject of his dissertation, as well as the history of Black people during the era of Reconstruction, which is a very, very powerful study. Was a pioneering sociologist, a pioneering historian, pioneering activist. For a number of years, he worked as the editor-in-chief of the Crisis magazine. He believed that ideas have the capacity to change society. What a fascinating idea, right? And so Du Bois, is a very powerful thinker. He also, and Greg Kamathikar writes about this, he also contributed significantly to what we call the African-centered philosophy of history. That is an orientation towards studying the past that centers us, right? I don't know if you went to public school, but I went to public school, and in all of the history education that I got in public school, Black people were a footnote. And I didn't go to school way back in the 1930s. I went to public school in the 80s and the 90s. And Black people were a footnote, which don't make no sense, especially given that all the schools I went to were predominantly Black on the south side of Chicago. So I don't really understand that. And so anyway, Du Bois contributed to us an orientation towards studying the past, where Black people were not a footnote, where we were not on the periphery historical phenomena, but we were in fact central to how we understand it. Well, anyway, I began, as I began to think about the ideas of Du Bois that needed to be engaged or that I desired to study, one was his contributions or his significance as a Pan-Africanist. And that is as someone who's concerned about the future and well-being and freedom of the African world, Africans in the U.S. and the Caribbean and South America, the African continent, and so forth. He was one of he was the principal organizer for the first Pan-African Congress after World War I, and participated in the subsequent Pan-African Congresses. And of course, he spends the last few years of his life in Ghana, living under the newly established government of Kwame Nkrumah. And so I picked Ghana principally for that reason. I wanted to understand how Du Bois's and Nkrumah's ideas about African freedom intersected, how they intersected with one another, right? I wanted to understand how Du Bois's work in Ghana contributed both to Nkrumah's project of African liberation. Again, for Nkrumah, he's really thinking about, Nkrumah's really in many respects a continental Pan-Africanist in terms of thinking about the freedom of the African continent, how that freedom can be affected, of course, while also recognizing this holds implications for the entire African world. And also to understand the ways in which perhaps Du Bois's work informed Nkrumah's project. And they're very, especially around education and historical knowledge, right? And so that's what brought me to Ghana. This is where Du Bois was. This is where Nkrumah was. And it ended up being a very fruitful endeavor. At that time, I was at the University of Education, Winneba. Winneba is a coastal town that is basically midway between Accra and Cape Coast, for those who are familiar with Ghana. And so it was a very rich and also rewarding experience. I was able to, go to a number of the historic sites associated with Du Bois, as well as Nkrumah, which was very, very powerful. And it was very interesting. One of the things about being there, which is fascinating, is that Ghana has loomed very prominently in the cultural imagination of Black people, probably since Nkrumah. And I would argue largely because of Nkrumah, when Nkrumah when he's inaugurated, Martin Luther King is there. Malcolm X, of course, visits Ghana. Ghana, many African Americans go to the African continent. I think Ghana is probably the number one place, certainly the number one place in West Africa, to be sure, right? Perhaps second, maybe Senegal is second to Ghana in that respect. And so there's a very strong affinity. And I wanted to, understand more specifically how both Du Bois and Nkrumah thought about the future, how they thought about the future, how they thought about the future of Black people and the future that Black people could create for themselves. And so that's what brought me there. There was the George Padmore Library. I have to give my certainly thank them, because they have some really great archival resources. So yeah, that's what brought me there. And so I'm writing about Du Bois. I'm finishing a book up now. That chapter with that discusses Du Bois and Nkrumah, there's actually an article in a journal if anybody's interested in looking it up. What is it called? I can't remember the title of it, but it's published it in 2019. If you Google my name and Du Bois and Nkrumah, it should pop up. And I'm finishing a book up on Du Bois that looks at Du Bois' significance as a social theorist. That is, someone who is attempting to develop theoretical knowledge pertaining to how we understand society, but also attempting to formulate ideas. And that's actually one of the things I talk about in that paper. What were the kind of ideas that both of them offered, the kind of proposals, I should say, that they offered in terms of the transformation of society. And so at any rate, Du Bois, very important thinker, and Ghana, of course, has a very, very significant history, both with respect to Nkrumah and Du Bois' intellectual legacy, but also with respect to the way in which each of these people, as well as many others, thought about knowledge and African unity, and as a basis for how we can transform our reality as a people.
Yeah, yes, indeed. That's what's up, man. I just left Ghana. That's where I was at before I came to Madagascar. I was out there for like 10 months. I got my Ghana card and everything, man.
Wow, excellent.
Trying to make that move. I've been to about 20 African countries, so I'm just trying to find the right fit for me,
I appreciate that.
The States.
I understand. I might be over there with you not too soon, not too distant future, given how wild this place is.
Right. But I definitely appreciate the work you're doing. I know we went a little bit over the time, and I'm glad we were able to make it happen.